I like going for walks in the bush, and I like thinking about front-end engineering. So in this podcast, I'm going to combine those two interests of mine. Today, I'm going to be sort of reflecting on the Popover API and dialogues and how they compare to the prior state of things and kind of my experience using them. So what are these sort of APIs trying to solve? And the answer is kind of layering, how we do layering in the browser. So, there are lots of different types of layering components. We have things like tooltips, popovers, toasts, modals. There's a whole range of various things that we want to have in another layer. Now, historically, how we achieve these experiences, there's a lot of hoops you kind of have to jump through. The first hoop is the fact that when you put an element in and you want it to just display on top of everything, you kind of need to jump through this hoop where you put that element, you can't just leave it sort of inline. And the reason for that is that sometimes there are stacking contexts that can cut off your what should be on top of everything else. A classic example of this is if you have, say, a scroll container and you try and show a layered component inside of there, it can get cut off by the scroll container. So the answer to this problem, I should say, a pretty common answer to this problem is portals. So the idea is that you, instead of rendering it as a sibling or as a child, this layered component, you instead pull it out and make it effectively like a direct child of the body element. And that way, you're not going to be necessarily susceptible to these stacking context issues or these sort of, you're not at the mercy of your parent CSS. And libraries like React have a first-class way of doing this, like with React portals, for example, and to make this all kind of work well. So that's one category of thing that we need to kind of think about. The next category of thing is aligning the layering component, or positioning, I should say, somewhere on the screen. So sometimes, say with a modal, you just want it in the center, or with a toast, you may always want it at the bottom. But there are a lot of other sort of layering components that you want to be kind of relative to some other element on the page. For example, like a pop-up or a tooltip, you want it to be kind of relative to something else, like a trigger. And so there's a few things you have to do. Usually you kind of, when the layer you want to start it, kind of need to get the positioning of that original element, like its coordinates on the page, and then you're kind of positioning this other thing kind of relative to it using the screen coordinates, right? So that's one thing you have to do, a decent amount of JavaScript there. But then you also have to handle, okay, well, what if there's not enough room, right? Like, let's say I wanted to show this particular pop-up like above a trigger, but there's not enough room for it. Like, okay, well, I need to fall back and show below or to the left or to the right of this element. And yeah, that can get pretty complicated. There's a great library out there called Popover, which kind of handles this. There are other ones around as well, I should say, but historically kind of Popover is quite a common one for solving that problem, where it will kind of automatically put it in an available spot, if you can't fit it. So that's kind of the context that we're all kind of wrestling with in the layering space. Now, I've been building my own little side project application, and what I've been trying to do is just use the brand new kind of Popover APIs and layering components and see how I can go. Ideally not even writing, not needing any kind of custom code or any kind of third-party library to help with it. So what you can do is firstly, the top layer problem that Portals was trying to solve, what you can do is you can render an element anywhere in the document, and if you add this popover attribute onto it and you show that popover, you can show it with JavaScript using element.showPopover. It will be rendered in a new layer called the top layer, which renders on top of everything. So even though it's in your document flow, it actually gets rendered visually on top of everything else, which is game-changing, right? I've got quite a lot of layering components in my app, toasts, modals, tooltips, drop-down menus, List goes on. In fact, that may be the list, but you get the idea. I have quite a lot of them. And I haven't had to use portals once because of this API. It's actually magical just to be able to render it into the document and have it sit on top, right? So it sits on top, and that solves that problem of I need a portal to render this thing out. So that's really nice. So that's the Popover API. The dialog element also has a similar thing, but generally you're using that to display what I've kind of found it's been used for is you're showing kind of modals with it. I think there are other use cases too, but I found like a big element in the middle of the page. That seems to be a really great use case for it. So the Popover API we can use to do this top layer thing. But the next problem we had was, okay, and you can use it to display elements and position them in fixed positions on the page. For example, a toast you might want on the bottom of the page. But how do you move this? Ideally, we want to tie the popover element to something else on the page. Like, for example, like a tooltip, you want it to be on a particular button, or you may want a button to trigger a drop-down menu or a pop-up, and you want it to be relative to that trigger. So the Popover API, if you only have that, you still can use JavaScript to position that Popover API. You can do the exact same thing you did before, where you get the coordinates of the trigger, and you get and then you measure how big you try and position this thing kind of where you want it to be. If you want it to be centered, you might have to do some top left kind of stuff. Oh, sorry, centered relative to that trigger. You might have to do some top left kind of values, and then you might need to do some negative transforms to get it into the right place. But, you can get it done with some JavaScript. But you then are in that same problem that I mentioned before, where you don't have any values. Like, what do you do if there's no room, right, in that desired spot? You have to potentially change the location of this layer. And you're kind of back in the territory of Popper.js, that complexity of, handling the positioning and falling back to other positions. So not ideal. And then I think enters the next, in my mind, critical piece of the equation, which is CSS anchor positioning. Now, this is relatively new. It's actually only available in Chrome, although my understanding is I think it's in Firefox Nightly, going to be shipped as I think it's in there nightly, and it's going to be shipped soon. And I think Safari is working on it. So you can't necessarily use it today, but the idea is that you can tie a layer to a particular element. So you give a name to an element, anchor name. It's a CSS property. You can set it using, an inline style or a class name. Set this CSS value. And then on the other end, your layer, you have, I think it's called anchor position. I could be wrong on that exact name, but effectively a way to tie these two elements together, the trigger or the thing you want to be relative to, and the layered component, the popover component, and you can link them together with that property. And then you can also specify, okay, I want it to be, there's all these preset positions. I want it to be on the inline, end in the center, right, of the trigger. Of what your point of the trigger element, for example, which is, pretty cool. And then, so just with a few lines of CSS, you can set up this positioning. So you get that initial positioning is just fully declarative, which is fantastic. Then there's this other feature called, you can do fallbacks for these, which I think is even newer, but it's working in Chrome today. And that's where you can say, okay, if there's no room, on where I want it, fall back to these positions. And you can have a whole list of them. So you can effectively specify almost any position, which then means that you can have your desired position for this layer, let's say below in the center. And if there's no room, it can fall back to all these other options. And all of that logic for figuring out whether it needs to use the one you desire or a fallback is all handled by the platform, right? You just write a few lines of CSS, and all of that fallback, layering kind of mathematics just kind of goes away from your application, which is it's honestly kind of magical and wonderful to use. So I've been using those two things, the Popover API and the CSS anchoring positioning API and having a really good time with those. On the Popover API, it's probably also worth calling out that there are a few different modes you can use popovers in. So the two main ones are manual and auto. Now, manual means that you control everything. You control when it opens, you control when it closes. Everything's very explicit, which that's kind of the one that I started with. And because I honestly didn't really know about auto at the time when I started it. And I got it all kind of working exactly how I wanted it to work. And then I discovered the auto keyword. And what that gives you, it gives you a decent amount of stuff for free. So you get, I think they call it light dismissal for free. So and if you start a popover that has the auto popover keyword, if you press escape, it will close. If you click outside the popover, it will close. The auto also kind of understands like nested pop-ups. So if you have like a popover in a popover, auto will be fine with that. And then if you kind of close them, it sort of takes care of that stacking of popovers for you, which honestly is awesome. And so even just today, I took out like pretty much a lot of code I had to handle escape to close and when you click, like once it's open, listing for click events, and if you click outside of the browser, outside of the popover, it should automatically close. I removed all that code and just using the auto one. It's also pretty clever too. So for example, let's say there's the trigger button and you click on it to show a pop-up. If you click on that trigger again, right, it closes the pop-up and doesn't open another one. Which sounds kind of like, yeah, obviously. But when you're wiring it up manually, you actually have to be a bit careful about that because like if you're listening for click events to open the thing and to close the thing, depending on the timing of when those event handlers are added or removed, you can actually get one click event kind of doing both actions. So thankfully, like the auto keyword, you just don't need to deal with that problem at all. What auto also does is it will return focus to the trigger once the popover is closed, which is awesome. So like if you click outside the popover or you click escape, it just gives focus right back, which is fantastic. Like I was doing that manually. This is before I knew auto existed. I was like, oh, this is, I got it working well and it was working like how I wanted it. And then I discovered that auto did it. I was like, oh, this is great. Like I can delete all this code. Yeah, this is really cool. So that's really nice. Like you kind of get that functionality for free. Something that was surprising to me though is that Popover, the default auto, doesn't give focus to any of the children in the popover. So for a lot of accessible kind of components, for accessible layers, you actually want to give focus kind of into the popover so that they can, engage with it. But by default, the Popover API doesn't give focus into any child. I've been exploring this space a little bit. It looks like you might be able to use the autofocus attribute on one of the items, and then it will kind of give focus to that to start with. But I'm kind of a bit scared about that. Honestly, I've had some pretty bad experiences with the autofocus prop in the past. And so what I've done for now, I might go back to that prop, I'll give it more of a play, but what I've done for now is I find the first focusable element and just call focus on it, after the popover is open. And that is working really well. And what's really cool is I give focus to that thing. And then when the user presses escape or closes the popover, like the Popover API still takes care of giving focus back to the trigger. So that's really nice. So all I needed to do was kind of manage that focus. Something else that was a little bit unexpected was when you're using the manual popovers. So first I was using manual popovers and setting focus on the first child. So first focusable kind of element in there. But when I switched to auto, the timing was a little bit different. I still could do it, but I actually had to wait an animation frame after it mounted before I could do that, manually give focus to the first child. So, I'm not sure what's happening there exactly, but there was a little bit of a timing difference with that one. So the auto popover will close on click outside of the popover. And that's great, but I wonder, it would be awesome if I could also have it so that, I could opt into closing it when they mouse down outside of the popover. So the reason for that is, like, let's say, like in my app, I have a sidebar and you can resize it. Like, I'd love to be able to just kind of close all the popovers when the user starts to resize. But the resize isn't a click, right? They mouse down on it, they start moving their pointer, and then, like, so the popover doesn't close. Now, it doesn't look horrible. It kind of looks fine, especially because the browser's taking care of all the positioning. But it kind of would be nice. Like, it is interesting. It's an interesting choice that it closes on click and not mouse down outside. I think a few of the shad CN kind of layering stuff use it like close on mouse down outside of it. That said, I'm pretty sure I could add, that mouse down, because you can have explicit, you can close the auto popover whenever you want. So I could kind of add the logic so that, when you mouse down outside of the popover, it closes to all my popovers. And that's totally fine. I might end up doing that. But it's just like, it would be great if I could just use auto, because auto already, gave me a fair amount. So it kind of feels a bit frustrating to have to add that. I mean, that said, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing there, like fighting the platform. They've decided that clicking outside popovers should close it. Maybe I should just leave that and not mess with that kind of expectation that users have, and just for resizing, kind of just cop it, because it's not the end of the world. That's what I'm kind of actually, now that I talk about it out loud, I think I'll just do that and just keep the standard kind of user expectations there. But yeah, I wonder if there's some more nuance in that space to be thought of. And just lastly, there is a popover attribute called hint, so there was auto, manual, and there's hint. Hint is, I think, a bit newer, and it's pretty much auto as well, except it has some extra functionality, which is kind of specifically around tooltips. I am using it, but I don't have the docs in front of me, so I can't remember exactly what it does. But my understanding is it has a little bit more kind of awareness, or sort of is, it is handled a little bit differently. So you can kind of have your auto pop up, and when it's opened, it won't necessarily show the tooltip on the thing that was trying to open it. Don't quote me on that exact rule, worth looking it up. But yeah, just sort of something to know that if you're using tooltips specifically, there is sort of some extra goodies there as well. Anyway, that's been my experience so far playing with the Popover API, and I'll catch you in the next one. All right, bye.